Awesome. Okay, so we're going to help you work on your skills to pass this exam that you're stressing about. I will be monitoring your discussion. My name is Nicole Moretti, and I'm a professional development instructor for the Bill of Rights Institute. And I will be watching your questions and try to answer some of those that can be answered in the chat. Otherwise, I'll gear those to our presenter. I just want you to know that the Bill of Rights Institute has one goal in mind with these webinars, and that is to simply help students prepare for the AP exam. We just want you to be successful. So this skills series is to help you improve your critical thinking and writing skills and anything that's going to help you get a better score on the AP exam. Today, we're going to focus on continuity and change and thesis writing. So please feel free to participate in the chat on YouTube. And right now, I would like to introduce you to our resident expert on AP Prep. He will be spending our 10 sessions helping you refine these skills. He is Mr. Daniel Jocz. He's a product of the public education system in Los Angeles. Since kindergarten, he attended Los Angeles Unified School District schools and went on to become the first in his family to go to college. Daniel graduated magna cum laude with degree in history from UCLA and earned his master's degree in education from the UCLA Teacher Education Program. A national board certified teacher, Mr. Jocz has selected as the 2016 California Teacher of the Year and was one of 4 finalists for National Teacher of the Year. He also likes long walks on the beach. So let's turn the time over to him and let's have a good time for the next hour.
All right, y'all. What's up, everyone? Nice to see some familiar faces in the chat. So shout out to my students who are here at 4 o'clock and all of the students all over the world. So first and foremost, wonderful people, today, as was mentioned, we're going to be taking a look at a big topic. And because we don't have a lot of time together, and I want to make the best use of our time, we have this graphic organizer that has all sorts of wonderful information. And so I'm going to start off today by quick kind of going through some of the big ideas about this topic of sectionalism and compromise. So hopefully this is review. And while I'm doing that, you might want to copy and put this file in your little computer window. And as I go through the PowerPoint, you can add some notes if you'd like. And then on the back half of today's session, we're then going to take a look at how to write the dreaded thesis, which it is hard, but you are going to be in good hands today. And so hopefully you'll feel pretty confident to get at least that point on the DBQ. So without further ado, if you haven't done so, make sure you get in this doc, you go to File, make a copy, and that will allow you access to this labor of love where I just kind of gave you way more than you ever could have hoped for when it came to sectionalism. And I'm going to walk us through it, and I'll tell you more about the document in just a moment. So let's get started, everyone. Just a quick check though. I'm just curious, where's everyone at? Put your city in the chat. I just feel like, I don't know, they do that in like movies or radio or something. Like, everyone shout out your city. All right, so today we're taking a look at sectionalism and compromise from 1787 to 1860. And this bad boy is pretty much one of the big themes from the early part of APUSH, usually semester 1. And I'm gonna go really quick. And I promise you at the end, if there's questions, I'm gonna clarify, but I'm gonna go quick to paint the big picture. And then once we're done with that, we're then gonna kind of circle back and then look at how would we handle a essay question with this particular prompt. So just to give you a definition, sectionalism is loyalty or support of a particular region or section of the nation. It's that dreaded S word, and rather than the US as a whole. And so you've probably heard about sectionalism for a whole bunch of chapters in APUSH, but today we're gonna kind of try to tie these events together. And you may remember, like early on, one of the first like beefs we had was at the Constitutional Convention, right? Everyone was kind of debating. The big argument was over representation when it came to Congress. And what I want to point out to you all, because a lot of students get this really confused, why does this matter? Well, they're determining who's going to be in the Senate, who's going to be in the House of Representatives, how many will each state get. And remember, there was that big old beef. And then the reason why this is important is those chambers, that legislative branch, they make bills, they pass laws, which have huge consequences. Laws about tariffs, bank policy, the future of slavery and territory. And so there was a lot of invested interest in this. And remember, different states had different size populations. Virginia had a whole ton of people, 750,000, whereas a place like, shout out anybody from Rhode Island up in here, they don't even have 70,000. And so the big debate is taking place, and eventually you come up with this great compromise. But this is not sectionalism. This is not sectionalism. A lot of people think any debate or conflict is sectionalism. That's not the case. Sectionalism is loyalty or support of a particular, once again, region or section of the nation rather than the US as a whole. And so that's really important because debates between large states and small states ain't it. But there was a sectional conflict at the Constitutional Convention. I like to think of it as our first one as a nation. Oh, it's so cute, our first little sectional conflict. And that is over the issue of slavery. And it's not about whether to ban it. That ain't on the table at the Constitutional Convention. It's about whether or not slaves should be counted in state populations. You know, are you going to count slaves? And ultimately, they decide at something called the 3/5 compromise, where slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person when deciding representation in the House of Reps. And so this is the first kind of sectional tension because it was in the South. All of the 13 colonies had slaves, but it was largely in the South where slavery was more important to those colonial economies, which were now under the Articles of Confederation and are now about to be under the new Constitution. Remember what happened, y'all. There was, after the American Revolution, slavery was slowly kind of eroding. It was gradually being abolished, first in the former New England colonies, then in those middle states. You can see in the yellow, orangey color, gradual emancipation. And it wasn't because these areas were more woke or less, you know, or more enlightened. It's partly the rhetoric of the American Revolution, but in large part, it's because economically slavery isn't really functional in these parts of the country. And what happens, and you probably remember this, is in the Deep South, especially with the arrival of the cotton gin, which makes cotton production much more efficient, you have the growth of cotton, especially in these deep Southern states. It becomes the cash crop. And even in the Upper South, you have things like tobacco and other products, which could be produced and raised with slave labor. And what ends up happening is with the growth of cotton production comes the growth of slavery, unfortunately. And so this is really important because, you know, we are the United States of America, but the three sides are becoming separate. Each section, and when I say section, I'm talking about the North, the South, and even the West. They have their own concerns, their own interest. And so early on, remember, we had beef between Northerners and Southerners, and it wasn't necessarily directly related to slavery. People in the North tended to be thumbs up for the tariff, thumbs up for the bank, and they tended to support a stronger federal government. On the flip side, Southerners, because they don't have that manufacturing and they don't really have a desire to kind of develop a manufacturing because slave system is so profitable and beneficial, they're against the tariff. They tended to be against the bank, and they tended, not always, be against the increased power of the federal government. So when it came to Hamilton's plan or Henry Clay's plan, when it came to those tariff things, it tended to be opposed by the South. That is an example of sectional tension. And remember, they made deals. If you listen to the Hamilton soundtrack, you know, they were in the room where it happens, making deals over moving the capital in the bank and assumption of state debts. But an important point to keep in mind is this. Sectional conflict over slavery was not, especially early on, about kind of the moral idealistic argument. It was about political power in Congress. And I'm going to show you what I mean in just a few moments. The other thing to keep in mind is not all sectional conflict was explicitly about slavery. There's example, debates over economic policy. Should we have a tariff? What about the bank? There were debates beyond slavery, although I would argue slavery becomes the core issue as we go on throughout the 19th century. So just keep that in point. But remember the War of 1812, and remember I'm going through the Google Doc, so we're going quick. Even in the War of 1812, you see sectional conflict kind of in the vote for the war. There were some Federalists outside the North, but not many. And they tended to vote against the War of 1812, against England for, 2.0. But the reason why is they were very much, especially in the New England area, largely involved in trade, shipping, and that's going to be bad for their business. So if you look, you will see the Federalist Party, which strength was in the North, tended to vote no for that war. So that's an example of a sectional vote about whether or not to go to war. Now, the big one, though, that most students really kind of remember is that Missouri one. And let me tell you why that's important in terms of the debate over slavery, because it's not as simple as it seems on the surface. And that's this. Remember, this was America. Oh, look at her. She's getting so big. And originally, there were 13 colonies. They were states. But 9 new states were added to the Union. Places like Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio. Between 1791 and 1819, you have new states, and there was a balance in 1819 between 11 slave states and 11 free states. What happens in 1819 is you have sectional tensions exploding. And the reason why is Missouri wants to enter the Union as a slave state, and that would threaten the balance of power. I took Algebra 2 3 times, y'all, so that means if you add 1 slave states, that would be 12 slave states and 11 free states. That means when it came to the votes in Congress, one section, in this case, the South, would be able to get legislation passed that benefited Southern interest. So it wasn't like Northerners were opposed to Missouri entering the Union because it was a slave state. It would have been nice if that was the argument, but it wasn't. It was an issue of political power in the South's favor. And what happens is you have a very important thing going on when Northerners decide someone issues something called the Talmadge Amendment, which would have prohibited the further introduction of slaves to Missouri. All slaves currently in Missouri would be free at the age of 25, and there would be gradual elimination of slavery in Missouri. So they actually passed this bill, but it does not pass the Senate. Remember, the North tended to have more people living up in it, so therefore they would have more representatives in the House of Reps. So Southerners were really worried about the Talmadge Amendment because they saw this as an attack on the institution of slavery. And what if this is the beginning? What if they slowly end slavery in Missouri and then it happens over in other places like Virginia or South Carolina or those states that had been around for a while? So because of the balance of power, Southerners are able to defeat the Talmadge Amendment in the Senate. It passes the House, but not the Senate. Now, you all know how the story goes, so we don't have to spend too much time. The homeboy, Henry Clay, gets the compromise going. So Missouri will be admitted as a slave state. Maine will come in as a free state. 1 + 11 is 12 on both sides, so happy there. And then they pass that 3630 line, which means no slavery north of that territory. That means the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, eventually that land will become states and they will be free states. At this point, you have Spain and then Mexico gets their independence. So no one's really thinking too much about what's going to go down here. And here's where a lot of people oversimplify it because it's easy to do. That's not the end of sectionalism, and it's not the end of sectionalism that does not have to do with slavery. There's a big crisis when the tariff situation takes place. And we're talking about that word sectionalism, starts with an S, slavery starts with an S. You know what else starts with an S?
You the real MVP.
Sexy A-push. Look at these people. I bet you didn't know you were going to get eye candy when you studied A-push. Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun are going to be in the mix during this period of time. And what happens here is not really a slavery issue at all. It's about this idea of the federal government is going to at times, and this is another big theme, to assert authority over states. And that's going to bring resistance from state governments at times in the North and at times in the South. And so this is going to be a big moment because let me run through it really quickly. You have the nullification crisis. And the nullification crisis is wild. It gets overlooked, but it's pretty remarkable what goes down. There's a tariff, and the goal of the tariff is to protect American industry against competition, so it benefits the North. If you're a Southerner, you don't like it, or if you're someone not involved in manufacturing, you don't like it because that drove up prices. And then that also may lead to other nations passing tariffs against American goods. And remember, this was a big part of the battle early on. Hamilton's tariff was opposed under the American system. Remember, there was an era of good feelings, but not really. Somewhat good feelings, but not completely. You have a protective tariff of 1816, which was supported only because of the transportation kind of benefits that people thought they might get. What goes down, though, is Southerners are viewing these tariffs as they, the South, remember sectionalism, regional interest over the national, were paying for Northern middle state manufacturing. And there's a concern, what if the federal government passes a bill aimed at slavery, like the Talmadge Amendment? What if the Northern states get enough votes in Congress to attack the institution of slavery? That's not the big concern here. It's this desire to get rid of this tariff, which was a very high tariff in the South's mind that favored Northern industry. The big crisis comes down when South Carolina takes the lead in resisting what they call the Tariff of Abominations. And your boy, John C. Calhoun, who at the time was vice president, publishes something secretly called the South Carolina Exposition in Protest. Basically says this tariff is unconstitutional and we have a right to nullify it. What does that mean, that word nullification? Well, they could decide that this was not going to be enforced in the state of South Carolina. And if you're thinking, what, nullification, that sounds familiar. Yeah, we heard that theory under the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions back under John Adams' administration. So different issue, same concept. States can ignore an act of the federal government. At least this is the argument. Now, what makes this so fascinating, besides these two handsome devils duking it out eventually, not literally, but almost, is Jackson's not a fan of tariffs, but yet he purportedly said our federal union, it must be preserved. He's the president of the United States. So even though he's not a fan of the tariff, he has a constitutional obligation to uphold the union. His vice president, though, the union next to our liberty, the most dear. And he's saying this tariff is an infringement on our liberty. Well, things really heat up when there's another tariff passed. And if you can't keep all the tariffs in mind, don't worry about that. But once again, this leads to an act of nullification. Nearly, in some people's minds, possibly a civil war, because in the South Carolina Convention, the Ordinance of Nullification in 1832 is passed. And basically, South Carolina says, we ain't collecting the tariff. What? What's up? What are you going to do about it? And then also, there's some people talking about leaving the union if anybody tries to collect the tariff or enforce it through military means. So Jackson now has an interesting deal, right? He's not a fan of the tariff. What does he do? He's more of a state rights guy, but he can't let the disunion kind of take place. And once again, you get your boy, Henry Clay, coming to the rescue with a compromise that becomes known as the olive branch and the sword. And there's the kind of force bill, compromise tariff, the kind of sectional tension slowly kind of fades away. So never forget Henry Clay, he's the real MVP. Now, this next part, I'm going to go even quicker because I want to get you to a thesis statement, but I want to point out something. There was sectionalism here. It was over whether or not slavery, population counting, and representation, and the slave trade also, which I failed to mention. Hamilton, there was sectional debates over his economic plan, as well as debates over the power of the federal government or state governments. Under Henry Clay's American system, there was debates over these issues. Slavery comes up in the Missouri Compromise, but it's about political power, not necessarily kind of really abolition as a thing. It's not, abolition is not popular at this point. It's going to have limited popularity even in the 1850s. The tariff is not necessarily, but here's what happens. Things get crazy when you get into the 1840s and 1850s, and then you get into the election of Lincoln. Let me give you the quick rundown. Remember what happens. Polk, your boy, manifest destiny. God wants us to have all this stuff. It's our destiny. Northerners and Southerners kind of believed this view, but it got muddy. It got complicated because with expansion came the question of slavery. Remember what happened in Texas. Texas literally was its own country for a brief period called the Lone Star Republic. Because when Texas fought their independence and Santa Anna said, nah, you're not actually free, Mexico refuses to recognize Texas independence. Texas looks to the United States for annexation. But Andrew Jackson recognizes the Lone Star Republic, but does not annex Texas. Those are some rhymes right there, I think. And what ends up happening, the request for annexation is delayed by Andrew Jackson, by the guy who looks like Wolverine's dad, Martin Van Buren, by all the presidents up until James K. Polk, because it would create a firestorm of controversy because Texas is big. What if it enters the Union as a slave state or many slave states? So they punt, they don't deal with it, kick it down the road for another day. Same thing with Mexico. When the United States went to war with Mexico and Mexico is forced to give up half of its territory. I'm literally zooming right now with y'all from formerly Mexican territory, Los Angeles. This is not only going to strain the relationship between the US and Mexico, but it's going to strain the relationship between the North and the South. During the war, Northerners called out Polk. A guy named Abraham Lincoln said, yo, did we really get attacked on American soil? The Spot Resolution. Northerners actually, one named David Wilmot from Pennsylvania said, hey, you know what we should do? We should ban slavery in any of the territories that were acquired by the Mexican-American War. And here's why.
Denied.
At this point, it's denied. The Southerners defeat it in the Senate as well. They say, no, you can't take our slaves. But the reason why this is important is when California tries to enter the Union, there was once again an equal balance of power. 15 free, 15 slave. And Southerners are increasingly on the defensive over slavery. They see the North as trying to chip away at it. And so all of this talk of expansion loses support, especially amongst Northerners, because they see it as nothing more than an expansion of the slaveocracy. And so you have this kind of fanning of the flames that takes place. And you know, there's one crisis after another. Compromise of 1850, once again, everything works out, at least temporarily. California, a free state. This area will be handled by popular sovereignty. Slave trade will be banned in Washington, D.C. There'll be a new fugitive slave law. That's going to lead to some bad stuff. And so there's all this stuff going on where they're temporarily able to get a resolution that makes both sides at least not completely angry. But even the compromises come back in the faces of the leaders of the nation. Let me give you an example. Fugitive slave law was passed under the Compromise of 1850. Basically, what you have is a huge increase of sectional tension because of that. Because now Northerners are resentful that they have slave catchers going through Northern territory looking for fugitive slaves. It basically turns the North into a hunting ground. And slaves were very much restricted in what they could do in terms of defending their innocence or their freedom. Northerners who assisted runaways could be arrested, and slaves were not allowed to testify in court and denied a jury trial. So this is making a lot of Northerners kind of distrust the South and, to some degree, for some of them, begin to speak out against the inhumanity of slavery. All of this, remember that Missouri Compromise? Well, that's going to come back to haunt them when, in an effort, not even about slavery, Stephen Douglas is just trying to get a choo-choo train going through Illinois. He proposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Let's set up 2 territories. And those 2 territories will allow the future of slavery to be determined by popular sovereignty. Why does he do this? Well, he knows the only way that the South is going to want to see these 2 areas eventually turn into states is if there was some possibility that slavery would be able to go there. And under the Missouri Compromise, 3630 said, nah. And so this repeals effectively the Missouri Compromise line by opening up slavery to an area of the country where it was previously banned. And guess what happens? Not only does the Whig Party fall apart over it, but there's a huge opposition in the North. Then that leads to Bleeding Kansas, where you have people getting murdered. Sack of Lawrence, Free Soil Town attacked by pro-slavery forces, Pottawatomie Creek, John Brown rolling up with the homies to attack some slavery supporters. And you have basically a civil war by 1856 between pro-slavery, represented by the Topeka government, and the pro-slavery represented by Lecompton, and the anti-slavery represented by Topeka. They're killing each other, Bleeding Kansas. And then you got people getting their head beat in Congress. All of this is happening. The violence over slavery is spreading from Kansas to the halls of Congress. Then you get the Dred Scott case, where Dred Scott tries to sue for his freedom. The case goes to the Supreme Court. That dude is the Chief Justice. He happens to be a Southern Democrat. And basically they rule, one, African Americans are not citizens, could not sue in court. And since slaves are property, they could not be taken away. And what this means is slavery is effectively, according to the Supreme Court, open to any territory. You can't ban slavery like they did in the Missouri Compromise, north of a territory. So that causes anger. And you could spend all day going through all the moments where Northerners distrust Southerners increase, or Southern distrust of Northerners goes down. But the problem is, it's just so much. And I don't want to kind of overwhelm us with this, but eventually though, you know what happens, 1860, the Republican Party wins for the first time. Lincoln is a minority president, even though he gets a majority of the electoral votes, he does not win a majority of the popular vote. He's not even on some Southern ballots, but he does win the presidency. And shortly after that, y'all know what happens there. South Carolina says deuces, and 7 other states will leave before Lincoln even takes office. And then, of course, Fort Sumter, Civil War, boom, the whole thing goes bye-bye. My goal was to get done by 4:30 with the overview, and I accomplished my goal. Ladies and gentlemen, questions before we switch to a thesis? That's a lot. My hope was we're connecting dots, seeing the big picture. If you didn't get it all right here, we got a whole bunch of stuff in here. I want to make sure that you feel well taken care of before we get to our thesis. So my folks on the other end, should we wait a few moments for people to kind of ask some questions, or should we pivot over to the thesis statement now? Let me know what you think would be the best. Where's the people in the chat? You're probably like, dude, what is this guy doing? He's talking too fast. Here, I'll say hi to you. Hi. Come here often. All right. So here's what I like to do. I chose thesis because I've found it is a challenge for people to get this point. And I want you all, this is my bootleg Photoshop of George Washington, thesis champion in APUSH. And I want you all to feel pretty good about this process, because if you don't know, if you're taking the test on the first round, because we're in a goofy year in 2021, there's a whole bunch of different APUSH test dates. First one, you have an LEQ. If you do an LEQ on the first round, you will be having a point for the thesis. Everyone, regardless of when you're taking it, will have a DBQ, and the thesis needs to be there. And what I want you to realize is this is what the rubric says. In terms of thesis, you need to respond to a prompt with the historically defensible, and I'm going to show you what this looks like, because I'm sure you've looked at the rubric before or gotten the rubric back. Historically defensible claim that establishes a line of reasoning. That second piece is so important, and the part of the grading criteria. It's not enough just to have an argument. You need to have a line of reasoning. And the thing that I want to remind you, if you want to make Theodore Roosevelt smile, or your teacher smile, or your family smile because you passed the exam and you don't have to pay for this class in college, is you need to answer all parts of the prompt. Sometimes they give you questions within questions. It has to have a historically defensible claim, and it must have a line of reasoning. You can't just restate the prompt. This is what I see so often. Shout out to my students that showed up today. This is what so many of you do, is just kind of reword the prompt and say, mic drop, I'm done. You must take a position, and you must have a line of reasoning. If you don't do those things, it is going to be extremely difficult to get that 1 point. And I would argue if you miss out on the thesis, you also miss out on points in terms of using evidence effectively. How do you use evidence to advance an argument if you don't have an argument? This is the question we're going to look at today together. And you may have seen it, you may have done it, or it may one day be on your exam. It is the prompt that says, evaluate the extent to which debates over slavery in the period from 1830 to 1860 led the US into the Civil War. And I know there's a bit of a delay, and I'm kind of looking back and forth between the chat and the screen. And I'm sorry for that, because I really wanted to get some feedback, but I also don't want to like wait for feedback and then we miss out on a chance to really look at this. But what I like you to kind of think in mind is, if you were doing this essay, and let's just say you don't have documents, where are you taking it? What direction do you go? And I'm going to show you where I've seen students go before, and I'm going to see where people kind of go astray. Now, if you're doing a DBQ, which most of you are, especially if you're in California, most of the schools are going to be doing the remote test, but every state's different. Here's a thing I want you to keep in mind before we look at this prompt one more time. When you actually do the essay, you're going to read and analyze the prompt. Okay, what is it saying? What's the time frame? You're going to quickly brainstorm. You're going to analyze the documents. Then you're going to write the essay. The reason why I'm reminding you of that is, listen to me carefully. This is counter to what I do as someone who thinks about these things deeply, but let the documents guide your thesis. The documents were chosen by the College Board and the creators of the test to give you a roadmap for the type of argument you could make. And I know some students think, well, I am an independent thinker and I'm going to just beast this essay and come up with an off-the-wall thesis. The problem with that is, even if you're correct, you're going to need those documents later on to defend. And it's easier to defend a thesis that the documents help versus the other way around. And the thing that I want to kind of point out, and I'm going to show you some examples, and I see a few folks saying, well, the thesis is the easiest part for me. And that, bless your soul, but for a lot of students, that's not the case. What I often will see is something like thesis number 1, you see right there. Debates over slavery in the period from 1830 to 1860 led the US into the Civil War. That ain't getting a point. And the reason why is all it's doing is kind of rewording the prompt without taking a position and not really kind of talk. There's no qualifier, because when they ask you, evaluate the extent, they want to know, was this a primary cause? Was this the main cause? Was there other factors? And all this is doing is kind of just regurgitating the prompt. It's not really doing what you need to do on the rubric. Let me give you another example. Events such as the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act increase sectional tensions in the US. What this is doing, it's factually correct. If you were trying to pay attention to my caffeinated review, that's true. Compromise of 1850, Kansas-Nebraska, ruined the Whig Party. Compromise of 1850 led to the Fugitive Slave Act, which led to the growth of a smaller but growing abolitionist movement. There was a lot of tensions. This doesn't really do it either. It does make a claim, but it's not the claim that is asking evaluate the extent. They want to know to what extent were the debates over slavery in the period 1830 and 1860, which is important. So don't be trying to do, what is it, Monday, Throwback Monday, and say, I'm going to talk about the 3/5 Compromise, or I'm going to spend a whole body paragraph on the Missouri Compromise. That's great, maybe for context, but it's not going to do it for it. So thesis 2 would also not get the point. And so, you know, the old joke amongst us nerdy APUSH teachers is AP stands for answer the prompt. And this is not answering the prompt. It's factually correct. And these are the ones I think break our teacher hearts just a little bit, because you know the students know things and you're like, darn, make a claim and start tackling this question. That one doesn't do it. Here's one more. Debate between the period from 1830 to 1860, debates over slavery had a great role in leading the US into the Civil War. What y'all think about this one? I don't know if the chat has caught up to real time yet. What's the vibe here? Anyone feeling this? Internet? So, okay, got a message. Some people are saying yes, yeah, you liking it? Because it does acknowledge the time frame. There's debates over slavery, which is what the question's asking. And it said great role. I mean, that's got to be like talking about the extent. That means a lot. The problem is, and the evidence is going to come later, right? You're not giving your whole essay. Your thesis is just the argument. The rest of your essay is going into it a little bit more. Yeah, thesis 3 is not going to get the point. Not going to get the point. Doesn't have a line of reasoning. Doesn't have the line of reasoning. You know, it says a great role, but that just kind of is overly vague. It doesn't really do it. It doesn't really kind of give you that line of reasoning, which will become your body paragraphs. And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about in just a moment. So I'm going to kind of give you a sample thesis. It ain't perfect. And I want you to also keep in mind, it doesn't need to be perfect. You are in a time crunch. You are in a time crunch. And I saw that someone said, how the heck do you do this in the appropriate amount of time? Just, you know, you got 60 minutes if it's a DBQ. How do you not spend all the livelong day trying to figure out a great thesis that you actually have the time to defend? And that's a reality. So you may be grammatically awkward. You may say things that are problematic in terms of its historical accuracy, but the readers are human beings. Some of them are my friends, and they are trained to do everything they can to find the ability to give you a point based upon the rubric which has been vetted and trained on. So if you take a look at this, I'm going to give you a thesis that is one way to approach this, and then I'm going to talk to you about a formula, which I think I saw someone in the chat talking about. What about a formula? I think Eileen is talking about that with although A and B, by far C. So I'm going to give you a thesis first, then I'm going to talk about the formula, because it gets a little, some people get confused. They start having algebra flashbacks with X, A, B plus this. So one thing, especially for those of you that, if your teacher has talked to you about the unicorn point. Have you all heard about unicorns in APUSH? Unicorns. There's a complexity point that gets kind of tossed around as the unicorn point. And the reason why it's called the unicorn point is because it is so hard to really describe. It's so hard to you can't see it in any one part of your essay. And it basically is throughout your essay, you recognize complexity in the context of the prompt you're acknowledging. So if you're wondering about this complexity point, I don't even try to teach it. I just try to teach my students to think historically. And if you know the gray area of history and you write that way, you'll be in a good position to get that complexity point or a unicorn point. So let me show you kind of how your thesis can help set you up for that. One thing that many students do is if you recognize the counter argument. So here is a counter argument for this particular prompt. Although disputes over economic policy and the role of the federal government contributed to sectional tensions that would help cause the Civil War. So this person, and this is actually a thesis that a student of mine wrote many, many years ago. I'm not here trying to give you a thesis that I wrote over an hour that's perfect, because that ain't the experience you're gonna have. So this was their counter argument. Economic policy, they're referencing vaguely like the tariff, the bank. Notice what they're not doing. They're not like, in 1828, there was a tariff, and then John C. Calhoun got mad, and then he wrote some stuff, and Andrew Jackson got madder, and then they had beef, and then there was sectionalism, but then Henry Clay rolled up, and then it was all good. Like, no, it's not the time to do that. So you can kind of make a claim, economic policy and the role of the federal government. And as is being pointed out by Joe, thesis could be multiple sentences. Doesn't need to be one great sentence. So for those of you that are worrying about how do I do this, don't worry about trying to make one beautiful sentence. Make 3 really weird ones that somehow form an argument, and you'll be okay. So there's their first part. They're recognizing the counter argument. So this is not their thesis. This is the other side. Here's where they go with it. They introduce their claim. Between the years 1830 to 1860, disputes over slavery would be the primary. So there's that evaluative, evaluate the extent, cause of the Civil War. So they're saying the main cause of the Civil War. And once again, you can write an essay that would get a point on this particular thesis without arguing slavery is the primary cause of the Civil War. I would argue it's not too grounded in history, but that's my opinion. But they're saying disputes over slavery would be the primary cause of the Civil War. So that's their claim. And then here's their line of reasoning. As territorial expansion brought the issue of slavery into national politics. So they're saying, because we're expanding, notice what they're not doing. They're not going, because we went to California, and then there was the spot resolution, and then Stephen Douglas, and then the railroads, and then the popular. They're not doing that. They're recognizing a big picture thing. As territorial expansion brought the issue of slavery into national politics, and distrust between the North and South grew following the Dred Scott decision and the events in Bleeding Kansas. Now, this thesis that I'm giving you is not the only way. I keep saying that because everyone always wants to see, like, would I get the point? Would I get the point? It's one option. And so what they're doing is, you got your line of reasoning, they have their 1-point thesis right here. And what's important to keep in mind is they're doing all the things they needed in the rubric. They're making a claim, they have a line of reasoning, they're answering all parts of the question that they have in front of me. Now, someone in the chat, I think I saw briefly, talked about thesis, and then although what they're doing, and many teachers have kind of talked about this, your English teacher may have even talked about it, is what some people kind of refer to as the thesis formula. For me, when I think this way, this is what slows me up when I'm writing a DBQ or an essay. I start getting all worried, like, what was the X again? So the formulas that are most commonly kind of discussed is the one that goes X, however, A, B, and C, therefore, boom. Or although X, Y, because A, B, C. And if you're going, what the heck? This is what it's supposed to mean. So X would be your counter argument. And I'm going to bring back the thesis we just saw, so you'll be able to see it in person. However, A, B, and C, so your reasoning, and therefore Y. The one you just saw did not do it this way. And you don't have to do either of these. As was mentioned, I believe, by Joe, yeah, it could be multiple sentences. It doesn't have to look this good or this organized, because chances are in 60 minutes, you're going to probably go through a period of, what did I do to my life? Hyperventilating, panic, and then you're going to start writing, and you're just going to write like a lunatic until you finally finish, or type like a lunatic if you're in 2021. Another way of the formula is this. Although X, this is what the one you just saw did. X is the counter argument. Y, which is your argument, your claim, because A, B, and C. Now notice something here. it doesn't need to have 3 reasons. It could be A, B. Doesn't need to have, it could be A, B, C, D. Almost forgot my alphabet, A, B, C, and I was like, oh darn. It can do any of those. So let's go back to the one we just looked at. This is kind of what they were doing, because in my class, we had kind of practiced this enough after school to kind of get a sense. So here's their counter. Although disputes over economic policy and the role of the federal government contributed to sectional tensions that would help cause the Civil War. So there's X. That's the counter. Between the years 1830 to 1860, disputes over slavery would be the primary cause of the Civil War. That's their argument. As territorial expansion brought the issue of slavery into national politics, there's their one line of reasoning, and distrust between the North and South, there's their other. Someone's asking, does it have to have a counter argument? No, you don't. Why might you want to do that? Well, chances are, when you're actually writing your essay, if you're going for the complexity point, this would be the part where you would kind of spend some time. So if it's a DBQ, maybe there's a document that talks about the tariff crisis. Maybe there's a document that talks about nullification. Maybe it's document 2. And maybe there's another document that is talking about the theory of nullification. It has nothing at all to do with slavery, directly at least. By recognizing the counter argument or the unicorn point, what you're able to do then is you'll more likely be able to bring those documents in, which if you've looked at the rubric, which I'm not going to do on this session, you need to use a certain number of rubrics. And in order to use a certain number of documents, forgive me. And in order to do that, you need to be able to kind of bring in different things that the documents are actually saying. So in this particular prompt, you may need to address factors other than slavery. And then if your choice is to say that slavery was still the primary cause, you're more than welcome to do that, but the other documents may not lend itself to that argument. So you may want to do the counter argument, 1, for that complexity unicorn point, 2, to give yourself better opportunities to bring in documents and to advance your argument with evidence. And so that's why I think the counter argument plays an important role beyond just, trying to get that complexity unicorn point that may or may not be there. So I want to pause for just a second and see if there's any questions that I can kind of directly address before we kind of go. There was one other thing that I wanted to take a look at. So what y'all thinking? Any questions out there? And while we're waiting, let's take a look at this as a group, just to kind of get a sense of what we would do with it. And so this particular prompt is very different than the last prompt, although I would say it does fit the theme of today's session. So let's kind of use the chat to kind of see what your thoughts are in terms of what kind of historical claims could we make when it comes to this prompt, that is, to what extent did political parties contribute to the development of national unity in the US between 1790 and 1840? So just out of curiosity, what do you think about this particular prompt and what a thesis? All right, hold up here, I'm getting the chat. Can you re-explain the unicorn point? You're all fascinated by unicorns. They're not real. Yeah, so it's just the complexity point, as Joe's pointing out. It's just, let me kind of go back here. I don't want to, maybe it's not a good idea to go down another essay. So this is kind of the counter argument. It's when you look at an event through kind of a complex lens. That's part of the rubric. So let me give you some examples, and I'll do a little teaser for tomorrow. If you're learning about the progressive movement, which tomorrow's session, we're going to be looking at reform movements in American history. We're going to be looking at the the progressive movement, the New Deal, and we're going to do a quick preview of the Great Society, and then we're going to be looking at how to do some SAQ stuff with them. The thing about the progressive movement, let's just say you had an evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement was successful at reforming American society. An example of a unicorn point that you might be able to do is you can argue that it was successful at regulating trust, or it was successful at beginning the protection of the environment, or consumer safety with the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. But a counter argument would be something to the effect of, although it was successful in regulating economics and consumer safety, the progressive movement failed to address the systematic racism in American life and address the democratic rights being denied of Black voters throughout much of the South. It's recognizing that the progressive movement was not completely successful. It had some success and it had some struggles and some failures. It's recognizing that gray in history. And so most teachers, myself included, we don't spend a terrible amount of time, especially when we don't have any time as is in class, talking about the unicorn point. It's more about training you to think very deeply on these issues and not giving the simple answer to things. And so that's why kind of if you set your thesis up with this kind of format, you have that opportunity. The complexity point does not need to be necessarily in the thesis. It's kind of judged holistically, looking at your essay as a whole. And that's another reason why we oftentimes call it a unicorn point, because it's not like one sentence. It's something that you're kind of doing throughout. And so I think it's important to just kind of recognize that and to write the strongest essay and the strongest argument possible so that you can be well prepared for that kind of point, at least for the thesis. Questions before we transition here? I got to get used to this delay. I know they told me. Now in experiencing it's weird. Yeah, so no, it does not. Let me kind of go through the chat to see, is there anything else? Yeah, and so someone's asking about the body paragraphs from a little bit ago. Let me kind of, that's a really good question. So what I would do is, if this essay, and if I recall correctly, that's exactly how this student ended up writing this. So their first body paragraph was actually their counter, where they addressed, because this was a DBQ that I had put together using an old prompt. And so this first one was where they looked at, yes, here's the tariff thing. This led to sectionalism. Yes, there was beef over these issues between North and South. And so though, if I remember correctly, there were 1 or 2 documents that did that. So their first body paragraph was their counter. Then their second body paragraph was looking at the way that Manifest Destiny and expansion brought the issue of slavery into national politics. And then their last paragraph was kind of going through just different consequences of those compromises and how at the heart of them was very much this issue of slavery. Once again, for those of you who are like, well, what if you want to argue that it wasn't the primary cause? You can, but once again, it depends on what your documents are saying. You don't want to argue against the documents, because then it makes getting the document points very, very difficult. Other questions? So this was the one we were going to do if the lag time was not as rampant as it has been. And this is just to kind of give you some last thoughts about this particular prompt. You know, this one you can really talk about the debates between Hamilton and Jefferson. And those were not necessarily sectionalism alone, because as we saw, it was about the debate about the role of the federal government. You could bring in, though, that Southerners tended to not want to support Hamilton's plan for manufacturing. They did not want to support the tariff because it was counter to their sectional interest. Their society was predominantly agricultural. And likewise, after the War of 1812, Henry Clay's American system found opposition partly because there was debates about the role of the federal government still. You know, there was the big thing, should the federal government pay for transportation improvements? But once again, there was also debates about the protective tariff of 1816 and things of that nature. So you could definitely bring in those things. And the role of political parties is political parties oftentimes were gaining their support from particular regions. In the case of the Whigs and the case of the Federalists, they tended to be supported in the northern part, and in the South tended to have more Democratic Republican support, or the National Republicans. All right. So hopefully that makes sense for you all. And if not, there is resources that are in the link at the bottom just to kind of show you. Let's just say that you got through today and you're like, what the heck? I don't remember what these events were. We do have resources right here that will assist you in hopefully kind of learning some of the material, and as well as the website that has all their stuff on it for free as well. So tomorrow we will be back, and better than ever, because the first one's always a little rocky. Like I said, we'll be taking a look at reforms, progressive movement, New Deal, preview of Great Society. We'll look at the SAQ, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. And just to let you know, most SAQ is going to be a beast this year. There are a lot of them, especially if you're taking testing window 2 or 3. I believe there's like 5 of them as of right now. I haven't checked in a while though. All right, sweet. So tell your peoples, come 4 o'clock, West Coast time, late night for you East Coasters. What'd you eat for dinner? Was it good?
Thank you, Daniel. Hey, I hope you guys found this really helpful. It was a great discussion. Great to see the questions. We're trying to keep Daniel so he can see all those great questions. So yes, come back and keep asking. I would like to encourage you guys to explore the Bill of Rights Institute's website and jump into the different resources that they provide there for you. Primary sources, homework help videos. My kids really like the homework help videos. They're short. Some of them are pretty entertaining. My personal favorite is the notorious Aaron Burr. It's pretty fabulous. Yeah. Check those out. I also strongly suggest that you look at Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, the Institute's virtual textbook. It's pretty much designed to meet the needs of U.S. history AP courses. You might find the narratives there and the primary sources. They do counterpoint debates in there. And each one of the units emphasize the time periods. So those are all resources that are on the Bill of Rights website, and they're absolutely free to use. So please use those. Last thing, I would like to encourage you all fabulous writers to enter the We the Students essay contest. First place is $7,500. And the topic this year is, what is the relationship between equality and justice? You know, it's not long. It's what, 500 to 800 words, I believe. You guys text that in like a 20-minute time period. Come on, less than that. Go ahead and enter that. So we will hope to see you back here tomorrow, same time, same place, and we'll get on with short answers, the SAQ practice. Have a great night, everyone.